This is one of the most desolate and unforgiving regions on Earth. Kholat Syakhl in the northern Ural Mountains, ruled by freezing winds and known by the local people as the Mountain of the Dead. The date is the winter of 1959. In the Soviet Union, in the shadow of the Cold War, 9 experienced mountaineers embarked on a journey from which they would never return. What they left behind was not just an abandoned camp, but a chilling mystery that remained unsolved for over 60 years, fueling countless conspiracy theories, movies, and books. Their tent had been slashed open from the inside, as if they were fleeing a danger within the tent. Despite the minus 30-degree cold and the darkness of the night, the team had abandoned their survival gear and left the campsite. Some were only thinly dressed, others were out in the snow in just their socks. Even stranger was the condition in which the hikers were later found. Some had suffered severe internal injuries, the kind doctors compared to the severity of a high-speed traffic accident. Yet from the outside, there was almost nothing to be seen. There were no marks of any kind. There was no sign of a struggle and nothing to indicate an encounter with a wild animal. And when investigators examined the clothing of some of the hikers, they found something that made no sense. Traces of radioactive contamination. In the middle of nowhere, on the clothes of civilian students. Unable to find any logical explanation, Soviet investigators closed the file with a note that would haunt researchers for decades. An unknown compelling force. Then they sealed off the area. No one was allowed to enter for exactly 3 years. So, what really happened on the slope of that mountain that night? The story begins with a group led by a brilliant 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. This team, consisting of 7 men and 2 women from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, were no ordinary hikers. Among them was Semyon Zolotaryov, a sports instructor and World War II veteran who had survived some of the most grueling campaigns of the Eastern Front. They were highly experienced in surviving harsh winter conditions. Each of them had previously completed demanding expeditions. This hike was intended to earn them the highest hiking certification available in the Soviet Union. Their goal was to reach Mount Otterton, one of the most difficult places to access at the time. They set out on January 23, 1959. Initially, there were 10 of them. However, a few days into the journey, one member, Yuri Yudin, fell ill and had to turn back. He said goodbye to his friends, hugged them, and watched them disappear into the snow. This decision saved him from the fate of the others. He would spend the rest of his days as the sole surviving member of the Dyatlov group, forever wondering what happened to his comrades. The final photos recovered from their diaries and cameras showed high morale and a joyful adventure despite the brutal conditions. They joked, laughed, and took pictures of each other as they trudged through the deep snow. They even wrote a small, humorous newspaper in their diaries where they poked fun at one another. These were not frightened people. These were confident, capable young mountaineers doing what they loved. But on the night of February 1st, everything changed. The group deviated slightly from their planned route and decided to set up camp on the slope of Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. This was a bare, wind-exposed spot above the tree line, near the summit. They dug into the snow to create a flat platform for their tent, ate their dinner, and got into their sleeping bags. No one knew it yet, but this would be the last quiet evening of the journey. When the group failed to send the telegram they had promised upon reaching their destination, their families began to worry. Search parties were organized. And weeks later, when search and rescue teams finally reached the area, what they found was a scene that even the most seasoned experts couldn't make sense of. The tent was barely visible under the snow, and it had been slashed open from the inside, torn outward with a knife. Think about what this means for a moment. The entrance to the tent was functional. It could have been opened in seconds, but the group didn't use it. Instead, faced with a sudden and overwhelming danger, they grabbed knives and cut through the fabric of their only shelter, abandoning the one thing protecting them from the Arctic cold. Whatever happened inside that tent had left them with no time, not even seconds. And inside, everything was eerily intact. Their boots were lined up in a row. Their coats and heavy clothing lay folded and ready. The food was laid out as if dinner had just been interrupted. And perhaps strangest of all, their portable stove, the device that could have kept them warm through the night, had never been set up, never been lit. 9 experienced mountaineers had walked out into a minus 30-degree night, leaving behind everything they needed to survive. No experienced hiker would ever do this, unless staying inside the tent was more dangerous than the freezing cold outside. The footprints found in the snow were even stranger. There were clearly visible tracks of 8 or 9 sets of footprints leading away from the tent down the slope. Some were barefoot, some were wearing only a single sock. But here's the detail that baffled investigators the most. The footprints were orderly. They were not the chaotic tracks of people sprinting in blind panic. The group had walked away from their tent into the freezing darkness toward the forest below, together in a relatively orderly line. Whatever they were leaving behind, they were leaving it intentionally. And then, about half a kilometer down, the tracks disappeared under the snow. The first members of the group were found at the edge of the forest, under a large cedar tree next to the remains of a small fire. Two of the men lay there in only their underwear, and the scene around them told a desperate story. The branches of the cedar tree had been broken up to a height of 5 meters. Someone had climbed the tree in the dark, breaking branches with their bare hands, perhaps to look back toward the tent, or perhaps to gather wood, and the men had stayed surprisingly close to the fire. Further up the slope, between the cedar tree and the tent, 3 more members of the group were found: Igor Dyatlov himself, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. Their positions revealed something interesting. All 3 were facing the tent. They weren't fleeing, they were trying to return. In a final effort to save the group, heading up the slope, against the wind, toward their buried equipment. One by one, with meters between them, their strength had failed, each having made it slightly further than the last. The closest, Kolmogorova, had managed to get within 2,000 feet of the tent before the cold finally overcame her. So the 9 people had split into groups. But why? Why would people fleeing the same dangers separate from one another in the harshest environment imaginable? Keep this question in mind, because when the answer finally came, it would change everything. The remaining 4 hikers were missing. Search teams scoured the area for weeks, then months. Winter gave way to spring. And in May, when the snow finally began to melt, they were found, lying in the bed of a small ravine under 4 meters of snow, about 250 feet away from the cedar tree. And this was where the case turned from a winter accident into one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. These 4 were dressed differently from the others. They were wearing layers, but the clothes were not their own. They were wearing items belonging to the 2 men found by the cedar tree. A pair of pants here, a sweater there, pieces of fabric cut and wrapped around their feet. The hikers had exchanged clothes. To some, this seemed sinister. But to survival experts, it told a story of grim logic. When it became clear that their friends at the fire could no longer be helped, the others did the only logical thing left. They took the extra layers to keep the living warm. Even on the brink of the impossible, they were still thinking. They were still fighting. However, the medical reports on these 4 baffled even the most experienced Soviet forensic examiners. The examining doctors likened the results to the impacts of a high-speed car crash. From the outside, there was almost nothing to be seen. There were no marks where the blows had occurred. It was as if a massive, evenly distributed pressure had acted upon them without ever touching the surface. The doctor stated clearly, no human could have caused this. The force required was absolutely beyond human strength. Then came the final and most bizarre piece of the puzzle. As part of the investigation, some of the hikers' clothing was tested in a radiological laboratory. The results were clear. Some items bore measurable traces of beta radiation, radioactive contamination, on the clothes of university students hundreds of kilometers away from everything, on a desolate mountain slope. Why was this test requested? And what exactly had been found? For decades, the full answer remained buried in Soviet archives. Weeks after the last members of the group were found, Soviet authorities abruptly closed the investigation. The lead investigator was reportedly ordered to wrap up the file quickly. The files were classified as secret. The official conclusion was recorded with that now infamous phrase, an unknown compelling force. And the entire area was closed to civilians for 3 years. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Cold War, this hasty silence only thickened the fog surrounding the case. And into this fog reigned theories. Some blamed the indigenous Mansi people, but the Mansi were peaceful. There were no other tracks in the snow and nothing had been stolen. Some blamed escaped prisoners from nearby camps. Same problem. No tracks, no theft, and injuries that no human could have caused. Some pointed to secret military weapons testing. Strange orange orbs of light in the sky had indeed been reported by other hikers in the area that winter, and the radiation seemed to fit this. Others suggested infrasound, rare wind patterns around the dome shape of the mountain, producing low-frequency vibrations that triggered irrational panic in the human brain. And of course, there were those who spoke of a creature in the snow or visitors from somewhere else entirely. 60 years of speculation, movies, documentaries, books, and no answers. But what about the most obvious explanation? An avalanche? Experts at the time dismissed this almost instantly and seemingly for good reasons. The slope where the tent was pitched looked too flat, well below the steepness normally required. There had been no fresh snowfall that night to add weight to the slope. When rescue teams arrived, there was no debris field, no classic signs of an avalanche, and most importantly, there was a gap of at least 9 hours between the moment the hikers cut into the snow to pitch their tent and the moment everything went wrong. Avalanches don't wait 9 hours. The theory was shelved, and the mystery deepened for 60 years. That was when, 60 years later, 2 scientists from Switzerland stepped in, Alexander Puzrin from ETH Zurich and Johan Gaume from EPFL in Lausanne. One was a geotechnical engineer specializing in how soil and snow masses collapse, and the other was an expert running one of the world's most advanced snow avalanche simulation laboratories. When Russian authorities reopened the case in 2019, this duo decided to solve the problem, not with speculation, but with mathematics. And what they found would finally shed light on that dark night. Puzrin and Gaume first debunked the slope was too flat argument. The uneven shape of snow-covered terrain can make a slope appear gentler than it is. When they analyzed the actual topography beneath the snow, they found that the campsite was close to the 30-degree threshold critical for avalanche formation. And the cut the hikers had made in the snow to pitch their tent, that flat, comfortable platform, had sliced through the snowpack and destabilized the entire slope above them. Without realizing it, they had set an invisible trap right above their own heads. But the key question still remained, why not immediately? Why 9 hours later? The answer lay in katabatic winds, heavy freezing air masses flowing downhill, carrying and depositing massive amounts of snow. According to the researchers' models, the strong winds that night had continuously piled fresh snow onto the block of snow the hikers had cut. It wasn't snowing from the sky. The wind itself was a transport mechanism that didn't show up in weather records. As the hours passed, gram by gram, the growing load began to crush the weak, slippery layer underneath. And finally, around midnight, roughly 9 to 9.5 hours after the cut, it reached the breaking point. The mathematics matched the timeline perfectly. But this was not a typical avalanche, a massive, roaring mass of snow. It was a much more insidious and rare phenomenon. A slab avalanche. A hard, dense slab of snow about 5 meters long, roughly the size and weight of an SUV, broke off and fell directly onto the tent. It was small, but heavy and fast. This also explained why there was no massive avalanche trail found at the scene. The slab that broke off was relatively small, and within hours, the same relentless winds had buried it, erasing every trace. By the time rescue teams arrived weeks later, the mountain had already hidden its own evidence. So how could this small slab explain the severe injuries described in the medical reports? This is where science turned to advanced simulations, animation technology developed by Disney Studios. Gaume had studied these exact simulations and adapted them into a scientific tool capable of modeling how snow interacts with the human body. Another crucial dataset came from a very different source, vehicle safety tests from the 1970s, where automotive companies studied crash forces. The data provided a remarkably close match to the Dyatlov case. The mountaineers had laid their sleeping bags over their skis to insulate themselves from the ground. The surface beneath them wasn't soft snow, it was hard, unyielding wood. When the computer models were run, the results were striking. A hardened, ice-cold, heavy slab of snow falling onto a hard surface produced exactly the effects described in the reports. The avalanche load was distributed evenly across the ground, but beneath the surface, all the force had been absorbed. The car crash without a car finally had its explanation. So what exactly happened that night? When the pieces are put in order, the reconstructed story explains everything, not as a series of riddles, but as an unbroken chain of events. It starts with the tent. When the slab fell around midnight, several of the group were injured in a single instant. The entrance was pinned under a massive weight, and the sagging fabric made it hard to breathe. Slashing the canvas wasn't madness. It was the only way out. Their boots and heavy clothes were buried under that same weight, unreachable in the dark, and their injured friends desperately needed help. So they left without them. And they did indeed walk. Those orderly footprints found in the snow were never the tracks of people fleeing from something. They were the tracks of a team carrying and supporting their wounded, moving only as fast as the injured allowed, heading toward the only shelter left on that mountain slope, the forest below. At the tree line, they built a fire. When it became clear that the fire was too weak, the group made a plan. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. The strongest three, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, made the bravest decision, to climb back up into the storm to reach the tent and their supplies. The remaining four gathered the extra clothes their friends no longer needed and descended into the ravine, digging a snow cave to escape the wind, an absolute textbook survival move. And there, the deep snow above the creek collapsed beneath them in a place where no one would find them until spring. Even the strangest remaining details now fall into place. In its final stages, severe hypothermia plays a trick on the human mind. People begin to take off their own clothes. This is called paradoxical undressing, and it has been documented in cold weather cases worldwide. Nothing about that night required a predator, an attacker, or force from the sky. Only snow, wind, cold, and time. And what about the radiation? Declassified records revealed that one of the hikers, Georgy Krivonishenko, had worked at the Mayak nuclear facility and participated in the cleanup efforts after the secret 1957 Kishtim disaster, one of the most serious nuclear accidents in history. Another member, Alexander Kolovatov, had also worked with radioactive materials. The traces on their clothes came not from the mountain, but from their own workplaces, a contamination they had unknowingly carried with them for years. In the paranoia of the Cold War, this detail turned a mundane fact into a myth. Expeditions in 2021 and beyond supported Puzrin and Gaume's theory. Researchers traveling to the pass observed that the area indeed carried an avalanche risk, and they documented similar slab formations under similar conditions on those exact slopes. These findings dismantled most of the long-standing theories, leaving the most plausible explanation standing alone. This discovery transforms the Dyatlov Pass case from a terrifying myth into a tragic natural event. But this doesn't diminish its impact. On the contrary, it deepens it, because these were not helpless figures overcome by mysterious forces, but 9 young people who faced the unpredictable power of nature with friendship and courage, refusing to abandon their injured comrades, risking everything to pull them from the collapsed tent, giving up their own clothes to keep each other warm, and holding on to one another until the very end. The unknown compelling force was never a monster. It was the mountain itself. And against it, they stood together until the end. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy historical mysteries illuminated by science, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next exploration. Goodbye.